I'm going to keep this straightforward because when you're looking at a high-end gaming rig, the biggest fear is ending up with a machine that looks impressive on paper but feels clunky once you plug it in. I've spent the last few days setting up the OMEN Max 45L, running a few of my regular titles, and comparing notes with a couple of friends who have similar builds. Link is in the description if you want to check the product details on Amazon. My goal here is to help you decide whether the specs line up with the real-world experience, and whether the price you'll pay actually translates into a smoother gaming life or just another box on your desk. First off, the OMEN Max isn't trying to be a budget solution. It ships with an AMD Ryzen 79800X3D, which brings that extra 3D V cache that AMD markets as a game-boosting feature. In practice, that means you'll notice a lift in titles that are heavily CPU-bound. Think Civilization VI, Starfield, or any massive RTS where the engine has to juggle dozens of units at once. I ran a couple of those while also streaming at 1080p, and the frame rate stayed solid, hovering around 7,080 frames per second with the graphics set to high medium. That's a clear sign the extra cache isn't just marketing fluff. It's actually giving you headroom when the CPU would otherwise be the bottleneck. The graphics card is an NVIDIA GeForce RTX 5070 with 16 GB of GDDR7 memory. That's a step up from the older 40 series cards you see in many pre-built rigs, and the extra VRM really shows up when you crank texture settings up in open-world games like Cyberpunk 2077 or Baldur's Gate 3. I pushed both games into ultra settings at 1440p, and the RTX 5070 kept the average frame rates above 60 frames per second. The card also supports DLSS 3, which, for anyone who hasn't tried it, can add a noticeable performance bump without sacrificing visual fidelity. In my tests, DLSS 3 gave me an extra 15 to 20 frames per second in a couple of demanding scenes, which is the kind of boost that makes the difference between a smooth run and occasional stutter. Now, let's talk storage and memory. A 1TB NVMe SSD is generous enough for a handful of large games, and the 32GB of DDR5 RAM means you won't be swapping when you have a few browsers, a streaming app, and a game running simultaneously. The real win here is the SSD's speed. I timed load times in Assassin's Creed Valhalla and saw it load the initial world in just under 6 seconds, which is a noticeable improvement over older SATA-based builds. That fast storage also makes it pleasant to switch between games without waiting for the OS to shuffle data around. All that power comes in a 45-liter case that HP calls Shadow Black. The design is sleek, with a matte finish that doesn't show fingerprints as much as glossy panels. The front panel has a single USB-C port, 2 USB-A 3.2 ports, and the usual audio jacks. I didn't have to hunt for an HDMI output on the back because the graphics card takes care of that. But the rear panel does feel a bit cramped. The PSU cables compete for space with the GPU's power connectors. If you're someone who likes to tinker or upgrade components later, you'll notice the cable routing is tighter than you'd find on a custom build. It's not a deal breaker, but it does mean you'll have to be careful when you open the case for the first time. Speaking of the power supply, HP includes a 750W unit. For most users, that's sufficient for the current configuration, but it's not a fully modular design. You'll have a few unused connectors dangling, which can make cable management a bit messy. If you ever decide to add another GPU or upgrade to a higher wattage PSU, you might have to replace the whole unit rather than just swapping modules. One of the hidden trade-offs is the cooling solution. The OMEN Max uses a proprietary liquid cooling loop for the CPU, paired with a couple of 120mm fans for case airflow. In a quiet room, the fans spin up to a modest 45 dB under load, which is acceptable for most gamers, but not exactly whisper quiet. I tested it in a small apartment, and the fan noise becomes noticeable when you push the RTX 5070 into max performance for extended periods. It's not an outright problem, but if you plan on long marathon sessions in a shared space, you might want to invest in a noise-dampening mat or keep the system under a desk. Now, who should actually consider buying this machine? If you're a serious PC gamer who wants a ready-to-play setup without spending weeks building and troubleshooting a custom rig, the OMEN Max checks a lot of boxes. It's especially appealing if you're into titles that lean heavily on CPU cache strategy, simulation, or large-scale multiplayer games, and you also want the flexibility of ray tracing and DLSS, without swapping GPUs down the line. The fact that Windows 11 Pro is pre-installed also means you get the latest security and gaming features right out of the box, which can save a novice.